In this week's 10-day trend, there's a lot of talk about heat. It's already going to be pretty hot across parts of the southeast through the end of this week. But will the heat become more widespread, perhaps even more intense as we go into next week? Well, a bit of uncertainty about that. I'll come on to it in a second. But let's look at next week on the whole. And this is our pressure anomaly chart from ECMWF. And the pinks showing that higher than average pressure, most likely on the whole for next week, across the whole of the UK and actually across much of Europe as well. And with that then, as you would expect with higher pressure, well, it's looking largely dry, drier than average across the central southern parts of the UK, much of central Europe as well, just the far north of the UK, perhaps having slightly more rain than we see at this time of year. Worth bearing in mind, this is looking at the whole week, and so, it doesn't mean it's going to be totally dry. There could be some rain around and there is some uncertainty. But also worth highlighting the temperatures. It does look like it will be significantly warmer than average on the whole next week, particularly towards southern parts of the UK. But before we get on to the whys, let's look at what's happening through the next few days. And currently we have a bit of a jet stream across us, yes, and low pressure towards the northwest of the UK, and they are going to interact of sorts. But this low pressure, it's been lingering, lurking to the northwest of us through much of this week, and it's the reason that whilst we've had some warmer, hotter weather towards the southeast, we've had cooler, showery, wetter, cloudier weather towards northwestern parts. And there's more of that to come through the next few days. We do have this frontal system lying across the UK at the moment, and this has various waves coming towards us along this front. And these waves will be bringing pulses of heavier, more intense rain, particularly to northwestern areas as we go through Thursday and also Friday. You can see a wave of rain coming through on Thursday, then another one coming through on Friday, all the while towards the southeast staying largely dry. And we're then going to see high pressure building through into the weekend. So for Saturday and Sunday, even northwestern parts should turn mostly dry. Not totally dry. There will be a few spots of rain around, the odd shower here and there. It's worth looking at some of the rainfall totals we can expect. On Thursday, it could be pretty wet across northern western parts of England, Wales and towards Scotland and Northern Ireland, maybe 20-30 millimetres in some places. But perhaps Friday bringing some heavier rain, especially to western parts of Scotland. Now, here I have our 24-hour rainfall totals being forecast by both the Met Office, ECMWF, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and GFS, the American model. And what you can see is, well, they're in good agreement for the position of that waving front, and so all going with the rain over mainly Scotland, Northern Ireland, perhaps clipping the far northwest of England and western Wales as well. Perhaps the GFS, however, is a bit wetter across western high grounds of Scotland. ECMWF and the Met Office, we're going with maybe 30-50 millimetres perhaps in the wettest spots, so a significant amount of rain, but not exceptional, and quite widely 10 to 20 millimetres, that kind of thing. The EC ever so slightly further south and east, but generally they're in pretty good agreement. That's interesting for something that's coming up later. But a big talking point are our temperatures. How hot's it going to get, and how hot will it be as we go into next week? Well, as well as bringing a fair amount of rain, this waving frontal system is also forming the boundary between fresher air towards the northwest of us and hotter air towards the southeast. Whilst we are going to drag in more of that hotter air on Friday, we could see that fresher air edging a little bit further south and eastwards again for Saturday as that front pushes its way across. So in the southeast, Saturday looks ever so slightly less hot than it will be through Friday. But I just wanted to highlight where this heat is coming from, and it's partly because of how hot it is. We have a bit of a heat dome across Western Europe at the moment, and that is becoming more widespread through the next few days. Temperatures in some places exceeding 40 Celsius. In France, for example, some station records. Paris could have its hottest June day. So that's worth bearing in mind. Let's look at the temperatures that we can expect then day on day for Thursday. And yes, it's a wet picture like I highlighted towards the northwest. And we do have a northwest-southeast split with our temperatures. Towards the southeast, high 20s. Quite likely, so some places likely to get above their heatwave threshold. Further north and west though, temperatures markedly down. Want to highlight at this point that we could see some thunderstorms developing in the southeast because of that hot, humid air that we have across us. By Friday, temperatures likely to be a little bit higher perhaps in the southeast, 29, 30, perhaps 31 or 32 Celsius possible in parts of the southeast. Again though, towards the north and west, a fair bit fresher, and we have that heavier, more persistent rain towards the northwest, so feeling a bit unpleasant at times, especially if you get any gusty winds with any heavier bursts of rain. Like I mentioned on Saturday, temperatures going down ever so slightly across parts of the southeast, but only by a couple of degrees really, that kind of thing. And elsewhere, it might actually feel a little bit warmer. Well, it will feel a little bit warmer because there's less rain around, greater chance of seeing some sunshine. As I mentioned though, it's not totally dry this weekend. A few showers are possible across parts of Scotland, maybe a few towards the south as well. By Sunday, perhaps the brightest day of the weekend for many of us, less cloud, less likely to see any spots of rain, and with that, even warmer, even hotter really towards the south. And worth highlighting that the heat will have spread a little bit further west, so high 20s quite likely across some parts of, well, maybe South Wales and more towards some western parts of southern England into the Midlands. We could be looking at high 20s. So whether or not we see a heat wave, well, that all comes down to Saturday really, because that does look like it will be the least hot day in the next few days. As a result, we may not quite get that 3-day period in many places, but I think we just about will in some parts of the southeast. What happens thereafter, however, and well, to get an understanding of that, we need to look across the other side of the Atlantic. The jet stream's running its way across, and that's allowing for an area of low pressure to develop. And how quickly, how deep, and how this then moves, well, that's really pivotal for what's going to happen with our weather during the early part of next week. Here I have the Met Office model, and you can see it brings this low pressure, it develops it, it deepens it, but it keeps it quite far out to the west of us. It then pushes its way northwards. With that then, with that low pressure here, that would allow us to drag in that hot air that's across Western Europe that I showed you earlier, and we will have across southern parts of the UK through this weekend. It allows that hot air to continue across us and if anything, push a little bit further north. And whilst there is some unsettled weather in association with this low pressure system, you can see there's a fair amount of rain, most of this is staying well to the west or northwest of us. But not all models are in agreement with the positioning and the development of this area of low pressure. We can look at that in a different way here. So here I have the Met Office model on the top, and I have the ECMWF member 0 on the bottom. And a couple of things. Well, you can see the stark difference between how it's handling this low pressure for this coming Monday. Notice, so a fairly deep low far to the northwest of the UK in the Met Office model. For ECMWF, it really doesn't develop that low anywhere near as much, and actually it brings some smaller features closer towards the UK. Now, if this comes off, you would expect some more changeable weather. Could actually be pretty wet, depending on which model you look at. But yeah, some more changeable weather if we see lower pressure closer towards the UK, and perhaps more notably, with this low pressure, we're dragging in that hot air, and so it could be pretty hot across southern parts in particular, but perhaps further north as well. But if we don't have that deep low to the west of us, then we're not going to have that real southerly flow. So perhaps it could be a fair bit fresher than some models suggest. Do want to highlight, this is ECMWF member 0, but different members are showing different things, doing different things with the positioning of the low and also higher pressure, which is near the UK. So this one has something a bit closer. So member 1 has something a little bit closer to the Met Office model, but still that low pressure is not as developed, so you wouldn't expect it to be perhaps quite as hot. Member 2 has low pressure nearer, but still not quite as deep. Member 3 has, well, it's quite flabby system that we have across with that one. It's quite a slack setup. So again, not really dragging in that hotter air from the south. Member 4, not too dissimilar. But member 5, I wanted to get as far as member 5 to just highlight that actually it looks very similar to the Met Office model in terms of the positioning of this low pressure, but it's a fair bit deeper. And if we see a deeper low, well, that would increase that southerly flow, and so we could see that hot or very warm air becoming more widespread, pushing across the whole of the UK and not being confined to just central southern parts. You know, in the southeast, it's really just been confined to there through this week, so that could be quite a change to what we've had recently. The other thing to bear in mind, and it's not just those temperatures that the position of that low will change, and I've already highlighted, but there could be some pretty wet weather around if we took that ECMWF deterministic at face value. So I showed you member 0, and that had potential to bring some pretty wet weather across many parts of the UK for Monday, which is a really different story to what the Met Office model and what the American model are going for. And so, ignore the label there, it says ECMWF, should say 24-hour rainfall totals. But it is it's likely to be largely dry on Monday, just the potential for a couple of heavier showers, maybe some thundery showers, they're being highlighted by GFS. But it's also not worth discounting the ECMWF suggestion that it actually could be markedly fresher and also a fair bit wetter. Like I say, some of that rain could be quite heavy. Not the most likely scenario, however. Then one other thing that I wanted to show you is the thickness. It should be 1,000 to 850 hectopascals. And the greater the thickness, the warmer the air that's coming through. And so what we can see is through Friday and into the weekend, that warmer air, that hotter air is really confined to just southeastern parts. But through the weekend, we can see it shifting a little bit further west. Yes, it gets edged back again on Saturday, as I mentioned before. But then by early next week, Monday, and then more so Tuesday, hints that we could see that heat a bit more widespread across southern areas. And then by Tuesday, pushing further north as well. Now, all of that is dependent on the position and the development of that area of low pressure that I mentioned out towards the Atlantic. So still a fair amount to play for at this stage. But really, there are kind of 3 setups for what we're going to see during the early to middle part of next week. Either that low pressure stays well to the west of us, but that could still bring a lot of fine weather and some hot weather as well, mainly in the south. And high pressure generally dominating, or that low pressure comes closer towards us like EC wanted, and that would bring a more unsettled picture and it wouldn't be as hot as with the first scenario, or perhaps the third scenario that has a deeper low pressure still to the west of us, but that would allow for that hot air to spread more widely, push further north across more places. Now, until we get a better understanding about what this is going to do, it's difficult to get a good idea about what's going to happen later in the week. But as I showed you at the start, I think generally higher pressure, more likely, generally dry, and warmer than average looks most likely as well. Of course, we will be keeping you up to date with the potential for any heat waves, any hot spells coming up through the next week or so, so make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. Bye-bye.